So my name is Susan McBride, and I am here with Lori Cummins, and we are going to be hopefully giving you some tips and tricks to pump up your PowerPoint. We want you to really make your presentation stand out. So the goal tonight is to provide you with some strategies and tips that will make your presentation, and in particular the slideshow portion of your presentation, more dynamic, more engaging, and with Zoom, hopefully you can be presenting a more visual presentation as well. So we will be covering 4 steps in our presentation. Just a moment. I think somebody's trying to get in. Let's pause. I'm getting, oh, no, we're good. We're going to be covering 4 steps to our pumped up slide presentation. We're going to start by talking about the importance of zeroing in on the big picture of your presentation. We're going to be then moving into looking at the specific content of each slide. We're going to look at tables, charts, and graphs. And finally, we'll go into some design tips. And if we have time, Lori and I are both going to do a quick little demo that will show you exactly how to go about implementing some of the things that we talked about tonight. So the first step in creating a dynamic slideshow presentation is to very broadly determine what the purpose of the slideshow is. What is the story you want to tell? What is the big picture, the headline of your presentation? It's very easy when you're preparing your slideshow to kind of get pulled into the weeds and to start zeroing in on the details. But if you start at the very highest level and gradually work your way down to the details, you can begin to zero in on what your main points are that you're trying to make. Remember that a slideshow is a visual representation of the content of your presentation. It's not your presentation. It's not the script. It's not the outline. It's a visual representation of what you're trying to present. So that's why it's important before you begin to plan the slides and think about the outline of your presentation. So you start with the outline. You start by kind of zeroing in on just what are the main big points. And then you can put your minor points underneath that. But when you have the outline, then you can begin to think about how you want to visually present this and what you want each slide to be. And hopefully we will provide some tips tonight that will help you as you think about what your visual presentation is going to be. So you've created your outline, you know what your big main points are, you know what your subpoints are. Now you're ready to plan the slideshow content. So you've done all this, you've kind of thought through the outline, you've thought through the content before you even open up PowerPoint. It's not open yet. You're not even thinking about the slideshow yet. You're thinking about the presentation and the content of the presentation. You can start going through that outline, identifying the main points at the very highest level, and those are going to be the main slides of your slideshow. Then you can think about, with each of those main points, how you want to incorporate visual objects with that, how you want to incorporate pictures or images or graphs or charts or other types of visualizations. Perhaps there's a theme that you want to carry through. You can think about what that theme would be. You also want to begin plotting out the content then of each individual slide. All of this brainstorming will take place before you open up PowerPoint. And as you begin to plan the content of each slide, there are several tips to keep in mind to help make the slideshow more dynamic. And this is really getting into the nitty-gritty now of what your slide, the slide itself, the content should be and what it shouldn't be. So the first tip is to present one main idea per slide. That's the big idea. You don't want to cram too much information on the slide. Is there a way that you can add an image to your slide? You've got one big idea. What image can you tie? What visual can you tie to that big idea to really make the point of what you're trying to say? How much text do you need to include in this particular slide? Is there a way that you can use visuals, some type of visual, to avoid using text? And we'll get into that a little bit later, what these different visuals are. In keeping with the one main idea per slide, what do you not want to include? What text can you leave off? You don't want your slide to be your script. You don't want to have all of your information on your slide and you're just reading from it. So to give you an example of what I mean, here is an example how I chose an image that I thought illustrated my point. One main idea per slide. I've got a bunch of light bulbs and one's lit up. So I'm trying to hit home visually with this slide that you only want to have one idea per slide. That doesn't mean that I won't go into more detail and give you more information about this particular idea, but I'm not going to put it on my slide because I want you to listen to me. I don't want you to read. You want to think about how you can use the slide to clarify your ideas, to emphasize key points, perhaps to show some relationships, but most importantly, to visually provide information that ensures your audience understands the message that you're trying to make. You don't want people watching your presentation to spend their time reading when they should be listening. And by tying your point to a visual aid, when you can, you're going to make it more memorable. People are going to remember your information more when it's tied to a visual aid as opposed to just having all of the text on the screen. So you could use a picture like I did here. You could use icons, charts and graphs, anything that is memorable that's really going to hit home the point that you're trying to make with that slide, and choosing an appropriate way to make that point through a visual image. When using images, you want to make them as big as possible. The bigger, the better. This will help you avoid too much text because you won't have room for the text if you've got a big image. So on the flip side, the don't, here's an example why you don't want to cram too much information on one slide. When putting together a slideshow, it's easy to fall into the bullet point trap. It's easy to rely on your slide to be your script, but this doesn't make for a very interesting slideshow. As you can see, compared with the last slide, using fewer words, larger image, this slide was a lot more interesting to look at. In addition, instead of reading the points on the slide, you're able to focus on what I'm actually saying when my script isn't right there in front of you. And this is a point that I'm going to talk about a little bit later too when we get to bullet points. So the second tip is to make your slide clean and easy to read. So at this point in the planning process, you've outlined your presentation, you've identified the main ideas that you want to include on your slides, and you're ready to begin designing your slideshow and each individual slide. So by creating slides that avoid clutter and extraneous pieces of information, they're going to be easier to read and easier to understand. If you follow the first tip, which is to keep one main point to the slide, you're already underway because it's going to be cleaner with just one main point. So making a clean and easy to read slide starts with choosing a layout design that is going to work well with the content that you want to include on that particular slide. So depending on what information you want to present on the slide, you can choose a slide template designed specifically for that. So if you are just going to include a text box with bullet points or with pieces of text, then that's the slide layout that you want to choose. I typically choose a design that will allow me to have images and also text, and I will show that a little bit later when I do a demonstration. You can choose a layout that will include tables and graphs, icons. There are lots of different ways to visually present this information. After you choose the slide layout, you want to choose the fonts. And you want to choose fonts that are easy to read. And you want to try to keep them consistent throughout your slideshow. So fonts that are easier to read generally are the sans serif fonts. Those are going to be Arial, Helvetica, Calibri, like that's what I've used here. In addition to the readability of the fonts, you want them to be large enough that they can be read. And particularly when you're presenting on a screen in person, when we are able to get back to that, you do want to make sure that the fonts are going to be large enough that people in the back of the room can see them. You also want to make sure that the text is easy to read and pay attention to the background. So if you've got a colored background, you don't want to have a font that is going to compete with it. If the background is dark, you want to use a lighter font. If the background is light, you want to use a darker font so that it can be seen readily and easily by the viewers. So for this slide, I was able to make my point through the picture, which is, I wanted to demonstrate that you want it to be clean and neat and tidy and organized, as opposed to the next slide, which breaks pretty much all of the guidelines that I just laid out for you. So for this slide, I chose a background that was somewhat chaotic and to help demonstrate the need that simpler images are a lot of times better when you're using a background picture. In addition, I've wanted to demonstrate how distracting it is to mix fonts. It's hard to read most of these fonts that I've chosen down here. They're too small. The font itself is difficult to read. And as you can see in the middle bullet point here, you can see the pitfalls of using a color that doesn't show up well with the background. So this is clearly a slide that shows what not to do. But I do want to point out that despite all that's wrong with this slide, there are a few things that are right. And if I had used all white text, all the same font, an easier to read font, and probably a larger font, the slide wouldn't be quite so bad. The other point I want to make here is that there are some elements of the slideshow that we're presenting tonight that we will be using consistently throughout. Consistency is important when you're putting together your slideshow. You want to have elements that are uniform throughout the slideshow to tie it together. But that doesn't mean that every single slide needs to be cookie cutter and exactly like the slide before. You can vary your layout. You just want to have kind of a thread or of a theme running through the presentation. That way there's some uniformity, but it's not boring. And there is a fine line between the two of those, but you'll know it when you see it. So tip number 3, as I've alluded to, is to use images. They make for a more memorable, but also a more interesting slideshow. As you can see, by choosing a large image, your point will really take off. In this case, imagine that the text on the slide has been picked up and carried off by this hawk, leaving behind the one main point that was too large and too heavy to carry off. That's what I want you to keep in mind when you're planning the text that you need to display on your slide. Images have greater impact on the audience than slides full of text. And when using an image, make it as large as you can without sacrificing the content of your slide. So use a full screen if you can, but you don't want to sacrifice what you're trying to say. So, that's not going to be appropriate for every slide. So you want to choose your pictures wisely too. One good picture is better than a couple of not so good pictures. And you want to make sure that it's a high enough resolution that it will appear crisp and clear and not get grainy and pixelated. And so when you're pulling images off the internet to use, which you can do, you really want to test it out and zoom in and make sure that when you zoom it really big, it doesn't look grainy and pixelated, because when you have it projected on a screen, all those imperfections are going to be amplified. So there are many sources where you can pull your images from to incorporate on your slideshow. So you can use images that you've saved to your hard drive. You can use images from PowerPoint. They have stock images that most of my images have been pulled straight from the PowerPoint stock images, which are of a high enough resolution and will work well in your slideshow. You can also pull images off the internet. But again, like I said, you want to test the resolution and make sure that they are going to look good in your presentation. Another benefit of using really large images is that it will help you to avoid the trap of using too much text. So here's the converse. This is everything that I just said on that last slide. And this slide demonstrates the pitfalls of using too much text. So I'm going to venture to guess that as soon as I showed you this slide, immediately you started reading what was on it, because that's human nature. You see words, you read them. When you're reading those words, you're not listening to what I'm saying. You can't hear it. It's not humanly possible. So also in a lot of presentations, when people see bullet points and words, they get out their pens and their papers and they just start writing down whatever's on the slide. That's also human nature. When they're writing it down, they're again not listening to what you're saying, not paying attention to you, they're paying attention to the slide. And finally, when you do need to use a slide, and you will need to use a slide that contains more words, you'll want to pause when you put the slide up and just let everybody read through it, take notes before you really get into the meat of it. And that way they're able to focus on you and not the slide. But you always want to look for ways to make the text easier to read and more visually appealing. So instead of doing a slide like this, which is pretty bland, lots of words and lots of bullet points, what I've done is I've taken the information on this slide and I've turned it into this slide. By changing the design, it's more pleasant to look at and it's a lot easier to digest the information. So this is an example of how you can use visuals to break up the text on a slide. There are fewer words, there's more graphic design, and greater interest to look at. So this slide, like I said, it contains the same information as the previous slide, but I've used a template that is provided in the Smart Art feature of PowerPoint. And then I've reduced the number of words in each bullet point. And by breaking this up into different colored boxes, reducing the amount of words in each bullet point, you end up with a much more manageable slide for the audience and for the presenter. So PowerPoint has a Smart Art library that contains a lot of design alternatives to bullet points. And I'm going to walk you through just kind of a couple of those when I do my demonstration at the end. Another way that I could have formatted this slide with the same information, completely different look, is like this. And this is by using icons. And these are all straight from PowerPoint. They're more visually interesting than words. I could have made these bigger, I think, in this particular slide. There's a lot of blank space on the slide. But they're a way for the audience to, again, remember what I'm saying by the use of a visual aid. So, if you go through each bullet point and the icons loosely relate to what the bullet point is trying to say. So one caution I want to make with the icons is that if you're going to use them, make sure they make sense. In this example, the icons pretty well represent the text that I'm presenting. If I couldn't find an icon that worked, I would probably forego using icons altogether, because if it doesn't make sense, there's no reason to use it. So this slide started out as a long bulleted list of words, and I turned it into something that is a lot more manageable and digestible. So that leads to my next tip, and that is, do use images to break up visuals. Don't use too many bullet points. And as I just showed you, your presentation will be a lot more interesting and will really capture your audience's attention better if you make use of the other visual tools in place of bullet points. You can use the smart art, and like I said, I'm going to show you, and that will create different design elements that presents your information in a more visual way. So instead of bullet points, you can use icons, you can use color, you can use smart art, and you can use animation. The visuals don't have to be static images. They can have some movement, like I just showed you. That was an animation that I added to float the objects in from the bottom. And you can also have the whole image come up at the same time, or I broke up, in this case, I broke up the smart art and had each item float in individually. Here's another example. So instead of bullet points, you can use icons. They are easier to read. They're easier to understand, and they're more engaging. So I just wanted to demonstrate to you how you can use different elements of animation and transitions that create movement on the slide to make it more interesting. And again, wanting to hit home the point of having bite-sized pieces of information floating in, zooming in, sliding in, appearing bit by bit, whatever the fashion. It creates smaller pieces of information for the audience to process in the moment, and it makes the slide make a little bit more sense. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lori, who's going to talk about tables and graphs and charts, and then she'll come back and I'll do some design tips.
Okay, thank you, Susan. So as Susan has been emphasizing throughout this presentation so far, most of the time a picture really is worth 1,000 words, especially when it comes to PowerPoint slides. And this is really especially true when you are trying to talk about anything that is data related, any type of data that you need to discuss during a PowerPoint presentation. You can really make a better impact if you use some sort of visualization. When used correctly, well-made charts and graphs really can enhance your presentation and actually can be a whole lot more effective at conveying certain types of information than any amount of text ever would be. So let me show you an example, maybe. So here's a table I made and inserted into PowerPoint. What you have here is the results of a 2019 survey done by the Pew Research Center, where they're looking at reading habits in the United States. So basically, they called a bunch of people and asked them, have you read a book in the last year and what format was in? As it is, there's a lot of information on this slide, but it isn't necessarily that easy to digest in this kind of numerical format. So numbers on a slide are a lot like words. Really, they add a lot of visual clutter. And my guess is that as soon as I put this up here, most of you started looking at the numbers and are trying to read them and are already sort of trying to digest and compare, you know, oh, 72% of US adults had read any format, but like, oh, only 65% of those were a print book, and you're trying to figure out, you know, what's going on in this table. And once you start reading the numbers and trying to compare, once again, you're no longer listening to me, the speaker. And PowerPoint really is intended to be a supplement to the speaker. It's not intended to take the place of the speaker. So unless for some reason it's required that you include tables, like if you're presenting research and you know, your field's standard requires that you put in some statistical tables or something, I would really suggest that you actually avoid using tables entirely. And where possible, I would use a visual representation of your data or results instead. So here's an example of what that will look like. So this slide is exactly the same information as was in the top 3 rows on that previous slide in the table, but this chart is actually much easier to understand, and it conveys the slide's main point a whole lot more effectively and much more quickly. So here's my, you know, nerd moment, but humans actually can process visual information about 60,000 times faster than they can text. It only takes the human brain 13 milliseconds to process an image, and it takes much longer than that to actually process text. So you can really make your point much more quickly with an image or a visual like this type of chart, where people are getting to see the relationship between the things you're talking about rather than just being told and then trying to imagine what those relationships look like in their own minds. In addition, the listener is really a lot more likely to remember the gist of the information when it's presented in a graphical format like this, rather than when it is presented in like a table format, or if I had simply written this out as bullet points. Another nerd moment, but visual memory, you can actually remember about 80% of what's shown in a picture versus only about 20% of what you read. So really, if you want your audience to remember what you're talking about and to be able to listen to you and see it quickly, using some type of data visualization is the way to go. So the type of chart I'm putting up here is called a bar chart or a graph. Sometimes this is called a column chart because the bars in this particular one are oriented vertically like columns. I'm going to call it a bar chart because that's what it is. And this is really considered a simple bar chart because we're really only looking at one line per category here. So we're really just comparing the different age groups on whether they had read a book in the past year, I believe is what I used for this one. So, you know, this is good, and it's certainly better than writing something out. But if we were really interested in providing more of the information that was in that table initially and wanted to make some comparisons, then you would really want to use a cluster, what's called a clustered or a grouped bar chart, which would be like this one. So you can see here, each age group has 4 different lines instead of just the one, and it's letting you make some quick comparisons about, oh, 18 to 29-year-olds. A lot of them have read a book in the last year, and most of those had said they read a print book, but there were also, a decent amount of people who read ebooks or listened to audiobooks. And then you can sort of also look at, oh, it looks like the trends are kind of similar between the different age groups. But I think that, audiobook reading is a bit less in the much older population here than among younger people. So this is all well and good, but when you use one of these charts, it's really important to think about what story you're trying to tell and make sure that you are designing your chart accordingly. So in this case, in this example, because we're talking about 2 different categories of information here, right? We have this age group category, but we also have a book format category, and you're really looking at both of those things simultaneously. And the way that you organize or design your chart is going to tell a different story. So you need to think about which thing is most important for you to highlight. Are you talking more about the age groups, or are you talking more about the format of the book in this example? So the way that I have this particular chart arranged is really kind of emphasizing comparison of the different book formats within any one of the 4 age groups. And you kind of also get this idea that people's format preferences are similar across the age groups. But there might be a better way that we could organize this. So this version of the chart is literally the exact same data as the last one. I changed nothing except for which thing I put on that bottom axis and which thing is creating the separate bars. So you can see here that this chart is actually, I think, a bit easier to interpret, and it tells my story a little bit better. You can really see the similarities between how much different age groups are choosing particular formats of books. And you can also much more easily see that print books are by far more popular than ebooks and audiobooks in this version. So if you imagined that you were what's called collapsing the age groups together, it's much easier to get a sense of, okay, if I turned the any format from 4 lines into 1, or I turned print book from 4 lines into 1 averaged together, what do I think that would look like? It's pretty easy to do that here. And it was not particularly easy to have any idea what it would look like to collapse those categories in the last one. So that's giving you my tip number 5, which is that visualizing your data is going to make your presentation much more interesting and easier for your audience to understand. So you should use charts and graphs to display your data if possible, if you're talking about data. But the don't in this situation is that you really should be careful not to make your graphs or charts too complicated. Because if you do that, you risk making the story really convoluted, and it becomes difficult to understand what you're talking about. So here's an example in this next slide. This is an example of why you don't want to include too many elements in your chart, because PowerPoint has built in all of these different options. I can go ahead and add in a trend line, which is what the dotted lines are. And I can also add in these the little lines at the top of the graph are called error bars. They're giving you a guess at the margin of error, like if you are thinking about election and polling results where they're telling you, plus or minus 3 percentage points, that's what that is. Then I also have some data labels thrown on here that's telling you the exact numbers for each one of the bars. And I threw in a table at the bottom that has the data too. And when you look at this, this is chaotic, and there's just too much, right? So the story is getting lost behind all of these little features, and you can no longer really tell what the point of the graph is. So it's really important to resist the temptation to just throw everything but the kitchen sink into a chart or a graph that you're making. And it's really important to strike a balance between using your charts wisely to convey as much information about the main point you're trying to make as possible. Striking a balance between that and including so much information that you actually end up doing yourself a disservice. You know, without all these extra elements, kind of like in the last one, I would argue that having this clustered bar chart is actually a better choice than if I were to make 4 simple bar charts, you know, with 1 line each on 4 separate slides, because you get more information and you can make more comparisons. But it's not so much information that you're losing sight of the main point. And so with that said, this all kind of is leading me to my next point, which is that I've been talking a lot about the bar column graphs so far, and they're very common and can be very useful. But there are also other types of charts that you can and should use. And it's really important that you choose the correct type of chart for the data you have if you're going to include that in your presentation. So this is my tip 6 is don't only use one type of chart, because some types of charts and graphs are better for displaying certain types of information than others. And choosing the wrong type of chart for the graph or for the data that you're trying to display can actually be confusing. And again, will detract from the story that you're trying to tell. So, for example, here is a nice chart I made about reading trends over time. And this is perfectly valid chart. There's nothing technically wrong with it, but it's not really the best option for conveying the message that I'm trying to talk about, which is how these usage or reading of these different book formats has changed in the past 10 years or so. So I could add extra elements to this, like some trend lines or something, to try and make my message more explicit. But again, that runs the risk of becoming really too visually chaotic, like the chart I just had on the last slide. And then your eye kind of doesn't know where to look. So for something like this, I would actually use a different type of chart entirely, like this one. So anytime that you are talking about trends over time, for the most part, or if you're trying to talk about predictions for the future, a line graph is really the way to go. You can see here that this is much easier to interpret. And it's much more obvious overall that, you know, when you sort of sit back and look at this, it looks like reading in the United States for adults has been pretty stable across the past 10 years or so, with some little fluctuations. And you can also get the sense that audiobooks seem to have been becoming more popular since 2015, and ebooks sort of in this measurement period were initially becoming more popular, but seem to have been leveling off. And that would have been much more difficult to take all that away from the last version of this that I showed you. So my next tip here, though, is don't rely solely on charts and graphs to visualize data when you have numerical information to present. But do use infographics or other types of interesting media, which could be movie embedded videos or screen sharing or any of those types of things, or screen recording, I mean, really. There are a lot of different types of charts and graphs built into PowerPoint. But if you have, so you have a lot of options But again, it has to be appropriate for the type of data that you're displaying, and not just like, oh, I should do something different, so let me throw in like a heat map when that's difficult for people to understand. And if you have a lot of data that you need to discuss in your presentation, if every other slide has some kind of chart or graph on it, it can quickly become boring once again. So really the tip here is to mix up the way you present your information in order to keep it interesting for your audience and to keep them engaged. So for example, this is once again a perfectly valid, there's nothing wrong with it, chart that I have made to include in a PowerPoint presentation. And I think, if you look at it enough, you can get the main points here that, this is talking about the amount of time that a typical librarian spends doing various tasks during the week. And wow, we spend a lot of time looking at email according to this. So you can get that point, but it might not be the most interesting way to convey this information, especially if you've already been showing charts and graphs, then it's just another chart or graph. So we could also use a pie chart like this one, which is good for showing how one particular thing like time or money or something is being distributed amongst different categories. But it's still not the most interesting way that we could display this information. You could certainly try to dress this pie chart up a little bit by making it 3D, changing the colors, and that makes it a more interesting and memorable visual. But I think we've all probably seen quite a few pie charts in our lifetime, and I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that pie charts are becoming a bit old hat. They're kind of like that song on the radio that you have just heard way too many times. Everybody loves a pie chart, and once you've seen one, you've kind of seen them all. So there isn't going to be anything particularly memorable about this. So, if you have the type of information that lends itself to something like this, sometimes it's actually best to avoid a chart or a graph entirely in favor of something that packs a more memorable visual punch, like this guy. So this is an infographic that is once again displaying the exact same information that I showed you on the previous two slides, but this is way more interesting to look at than any of the other graphs I've shown. It's it's colorful, it's interesting, it's got a little bit of a play on what we're talking about here because the bars look like books. So I would argue that for this type of thing, this is much more engaging to include in your slideshow than just, another bar chart or another pie chart that we've all seen a million times. One thing I would like to point out here, though, is that this is actually a good example of one of Susan's earlier points about choosing high quality images. So I did not make this infographic. I borrowed this from a website for illustrated purposes. And if you look at it closely enough, you can see that the text doesn't really look great or sharp because I had to enlarge this from the size that it was originally on the website. And now it's kind of hard to read. So what I would say here is that when it comes to using things like charts and graphs and infographics in a PowerPoint presentation, the majority of the time, it's actually better to take the time to make those within PowerPoint itself rather than copying and pasting them from somewhere else. And I know that that's probably going to elicit a collective groan about, oh, this already exists, why would I want to make it again? It seems a little bit like we're reinventing the wheel here. But I'm going to go ahead and argue that it's actually worthwhile to do that because it gives you a lot more control over the way that the graphics you're using in your presentation are displayed and what they look like while you are presenting. So here's the same infographic essentially, except I made this one in PowerPoint in under an hour. I just made it look pretty close. I think I made it look pretty close to the one that I did, or the one that I stole from the website. And if I spent a little bit more time really tweaking some things, I think I could make it look pretty spot on, almost exactly like the last version. But you can see here that because I made this, I have a lot more control over what the font looks like, what size it is, and whether you can read it when it's this size. And I can also resize this as much as I want. And because it's native to PowerPoint, or it's within PowerPoint, PowerPoint will actually adjust the graphics and the font sizes so that they're still readable. So, you know, I can make this smaller, or I can make it giant, but you still have the definition there in the text, and it doesn't look like you just took something that's small and blew it up and then it became all kinds of blurry. So if I had done that in the previous slide, it would just become more and more and more difficult to read. So that's pretty much what I have to say about charts and graphs. They're definitely useful, and you should include them when you have information that's numerical that you need to talk about. Although, you don't, at the same time, like with everything, there's always a balance. So you don't want to have a whole presentation full of charts and graphs, because that's boring. But a well-placed chart or graph, when you have a big point to talk about, can really be useful. If you have something smaller, you know, it might not be worth displaying a whole graph. Perhaps instead you might just want to find a different, you know, smart art or some other type of visualization to use. If your whole point is that audiobooks are becoming more popular, then you don't need that whole graph that I presented here. So I know that there's lots more types of charts and graphs, but this is probably enough to sort of get you started on thinking about what some of the best ways might be to include this, to represent visually this type of information in a PowerPoint. And with that, I'm going to send it back over to Susan.
Thank you. So I'm going to give just a couple of design tips and how-tos, and I will end up then with doing a demonstration of starting off a slideshow and how I go through planning out what it's going to look like. So the tips that we've been providing have hopefully help you put together a slideshow that's going to be engaging and dynamic. So how do you then take what we've said and actually implement it? And that's what I want to talk about now. There are many ways you can go about creating the overall design of your slideshow. And so you're going to want to play around with it and see what's going to work best for you and what's going to work best for the presentation that you're going to be making. So for me, I always like to start with the visual and the image part. I've got a graphic background, so that's probably why. But I do like to start with the image and kind of go from there. The images are going to have a greater impact on your presentation and on the memorability of it and on to the audience. So that's another reason to start with kind of the visual part of it, the image. Then I go slide by slide and design each slide based upon what I want to be presenting in that slide. And then finally, I will think about the text, but that's kind of the last place I go. I start with the image and the design of the slide and then slip the text in at the end. And so last, I want to do a quick demonstration and walk you through kind of how to do certain bits and pieces of what we've talked about. So in the demonstration, I'm going to show you how to make use of PowerPoint stock images, how to find the icons and use those. I will show you smart art and how you can incorporate that into your slides. I want to talk briefly about transitions between slides and then animation within a slide. And that's an example of that would be what I was just doing. I was clicking and pulling in each of these color blocks individually, and that's an animation. So at this point, I am going to go ahead and dive right into a quick demonstration. I am going to be going kind of quickly because I don't want to, it's running late. And but if you do have questions as I go along, please use the Q&A in the Zoom to ask questions. And Lori, if you could keep an eye on them and shout them out, that would be fine. So let me go back to, I'm going to end the slideshow. And I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute and get my thing set up to do this demonstration. Okay. Okay. So when you open up PowerPoint, this is kind of what you're going to get. And my first step here is to go to the Design tab up at the top. And it's going to pull up some kind of preset designs. And any one of these is fine. There's nothing wrong with any of them. The key is to find the one that you think is going to work best for you. And you can click around and see what the different designs look like. The colors in these little boxes underneath the fonts are, we'll show you kind of what the color scheme is of that particular design. And then within each theme, there are variants. So I'm going to choose this retrospective design. And then within that design, there are all these different variants, and the variants are going to be changes in color primarily. So I'm going to be, yes.
We do have a question.
Yes.
And I don't know if you will know this off the top of your head.
Yes.
First question is, what is the best resolution size for images?
Oh, as large as you can get. So I looked that up because I wanted to include that information in the slideshow, and there are a lot of caveats to that. So there's not a really clear answer for that. Some of that is going to depend on what size slide you choose, which is over here next to the background. So I don't have a great answer for that. Try to get as big a resolution as possible. And like I said, blow it up and see if it looks grainy or not. You can tell if you take it to 200 or 400%, you can tell right away if it's going to work in your slideshow or not. But in terms of just numbers, it's going to depend upon a couple of different variants. And it's going to depend on whether you're showing it on a computer screen on Zoom, like I am right now, or if you're projecting it onto a larger screen. And then you really want to be careful with pixels. But again, if you blow it up to 400% or even 200%, you'll be able to tell if it's going to look bad displayed on a screen.
The gist there is you can always make something that's very high resolution smaller to fit on your screen, but something that's low resolution when you try to make it bigger is going to look bad. So
correct.
As high of a resolution as possible.
Correct.
The second question is, what font did you use again on the font slide?
I was using Calibri. And I will say that with the themes here, each theme has a font built into it. And so it's showing you the letters that are on the little thumbnail pictures here are the actual fonts that are on that theme. So you can choose a theme based purely on the font when you're choosing your original design theme. most of these themes are going to be fine. This one, this wood type, has a kind of odd font, and the organic has, you know, more of a Times New Roman or a serif font. But any of these are going to be fine, and the slides are going to be already preloaded with, you know, fonts, and the font is going to stay the same throughout the slide. So that's one benefit of choosing this design first. So for the demonstration, I'm going to pick retrospect, and I'm going to pick this first variant because I'm going to be starting a slide presentation for an upcoming program that I'm doing called Kitchen Tech, All Things Italy, on March 10th, if you're interested. And so I like this particular one because the colors remind me of Tuscany, and I think it'll fit in well with the theme that I'm choosing. So I'm going to choose that variant. So the first step is to choose your design, choose your variant, and then you can dig right into the slides. Now this slide, which is the one that automatically comes up when you open a new PowerPoint presentation, is built to have two text boxes. There's the title, click to add a title, and then the subtitle. I rarely use this particular slide because, as you guessed from my presentation, I really favor using images. So I'm going to go under the back to the home button and pick a new slide. When I click on that, it will open up this box of options on all the different slides that I can choose. So the title slide is the one that you just saw that automatically comes up. I prefer to use title and content. And what that means is it allows me to add content, and that content can be, well, I'll show you. Let me add it. So here it shows me what the content can be. I can add a table or a chart. I can add, this icon is smart art. This icon is for icons. This would be if I wanted to pull an image off my hard drive. This would be if I wanted to pull an image off of the internet. And then this last icon here is if I want to embed a video.
I'll just throw in there that if you are using the desktop version of PowerPoint, you will also have an option to insert a chart, or yeah, a chart or a graph will show
Right.
up in that menu too.
And thanks, Lori. What I'm using right now is the web version of PowerPoint because the desktop version that the library uses is kind of a stripped down version, and it doesn't do some of the things that I want to show you. So I am using the web version right now. So this is the slide I'm going to start with, and I'm going to go ahead and delete this first slide because I don't need it. And I'm going to type in the title. Sorry, bear with me. I'm using two different computers right now. And then I'm going to go ahead and, whoops, sorry, I'm going to go ahead and grab my picture. So I'm going to show you here when I click on this button, it's going to pull up a bunch of stock images. These are images that are already loaded into PowerPoint. And if I use one of these, I've got a safety net that I know that they're already set up to be in part of a PowerPoint presentation. So their resolution is going to be great. And there are literally thousands of images. I could scroll through the whole thing. Different topics I could choose. You saw there are subheads here. I could choose any number of these subheads. I'm going to go ahead and type Italy in and just see what I get. And it pulls up a bunch of pictures that could be somehow loosely or closely related to Italy. And I'm going to pick this picture of Florence because it's so iconic, Italy. And I'm going to insert that into my PowerPoint. So when I do that, immediately, if you look over to the right column here, this is the design Genie. And if this doesn't come up for you, then you just have to click this icon up here that says designer, and it will pull up the design genie. And the design genie will take the theme of the slideshow that I picked at the beginning and marry it with what I've already entered into the slide. And I'm going to just scroll down. What I would like to do is really highlight that picture because I don't have much text to put on this slide. So I'm just going to keep scrolling through the ideas that they give me until I find something that I like. And hopefully, okay, so this is the one I want to use down at the bottom because I like getting as much of that picture as possible. The other point I want to make here is that I think the text is way too small. So I want to go ahead and click on that and I can make it much bigger. Let's see what 60 looks like. It's pretty good. And then I can take this, and when I get the crosshatch there, it means I can move the text around. I'm just going to kind of center it up and make it look good. And so I'm pretty happy with that. I think that's a pretty nice first page to this slideshow. So now I'm going to add my next slide. So I'm going to go up here and click on the new slide, and I get to choose what I want to, which slide I want to put in. And I know that I'm going to include some more pictures, and I know that I'm going to include some text. So for a slide that's got two different things going on, this to content template is usually my go-to because I know that I can import a picture and then I can also have a space to put some text or some other element. So I'm going to add that slide.
This is a good point we had a question come in, which I answered, but I'm gonna, I'll throw it in here too. The question was about how we knew what each of those little icons in the content area stands for. And I commented that the little icons that are in your content area look the same as if you were on the insert menu, you'll see the same little icons.
There you
go. And I believe that if you hover your cursor over the little icons, it will tell you.
Oh, down here?
Yeah.
It doesn't tell you.
If it doesn't tell you there, it does up in the top, I believe, or it says underneath it somewhere.
But if you click, you can click on it too, and it's going to take you up to the, it'll take you to what it is. So I can insert a table and it's going to ask me how many rows and columns, or it's going to, I can click on the, the icon, and it will take me to the icons.
I believe it tells you if you hover when you're using the desktop version.
Okay.
Yeah. But just so everybody can hear the answer to that.
Sure. So, so I went ahead and added the title here, and now I want to put a picture in. And I liked the picture of Venice that was on here. So I'm going to go back into the images, search for Italy, and another iconic picture of Italy, Venice. So I'm going to put that in. And then instantly the design genie does its work and it gives me a couple different layouts. So I know that I'm going to put smart art over here. So I think I'm going to go ahead and insert that before I choose what layout I want. So I'm going to pull up the smart art genie and I'm going to go ahead. This is not the actual smart art that I want to use, but I'm going to go ahead and use it right now. And then I'll change it once I've picked the design of the page because it works better that way. So what I want to do is type in the topics that I'm going to be discussing in this presentation. I'm going to kind of give a roadmap of what this presentation is about. So you can see I'm typing over here where it says type your text here, and it's auto-filling it into the graphic. And it's just doing that automatically. So these are the topics that we're going to be discussing in this presentation. All right, so that's that. I'll close that. And so it's laid them out for me, and then it's shown me over here some different layouts that I can use. And just for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and just choose this layout because it's a nice big picture, and I like the way this looks. But I don't like the way this smart art looks. And like I said, I'm going to do this last because otherwise it will mess up the design Genie. So I'm going to come over here and click on the smart art, and then up at the top, the smart art menu item lit up. And I'm going to click on that. And then I'm going to come over here, and it's going to give me options of different types of smart art that I can use. And one of the ones I like to use instead of a bulleted list, which is kind of what I presented there, is this vertical bulleted list. And it just kind of layers everything right in there, nice and clean and neat and tidy. The other thing that I can do then is I can change the colors of these different boxes right here. So if I can click on this, it will pull up a lot of different options. These options are all tied back to that original design theme that I chose. So when you choose your design theme and you choose your color theme, that's what's going to dictate what shows up in this particular graphic and throughout all of your choices when you're using the design Genie. So I'm going to use the colorful one because I like more color. That's pretty much it. Now, if I wanted to have these appear one by one, like I did in my last graphic of my slide, I can do that. That's an animation. So I will click on the smart art, and then I'm going to come up here to animations, and I'm going to have them fly in. That means they're going to kind of fly in. And then I can choose what direction I want them to come in. Do I want them to come up from the bottom, from the left, from the top, from the right? In this case, I'm going to have them come up from the bottom. And then I can go back to that options, and I can have it fly in as one object, which means the whole thing is going to come up together, or I can have them come in one by one. So I'm going to choose the one by one. And when I'm done, I'll show you what this all looks like. So I think I'm done with that slide. So I'm going to go back to the home, and I'm going to add my next slide. And again, I'm going to incorporate a picture, and I'm going to incorporate a graphic. So I'm going to go with this to content slide again. And here's a spoiler alert. I use the to content slide pretty much for every single slide. I think it's the best slide out there, unless I'm doing like a slide that's just a picture, like a subhead of a section of the slideshow. So I'm going to add that to content slide again. And this one is going to be just on, I'm beginning the pizza portion of the presentation. And I want to choose an image, and I know I've got an image on my desktop that I want to use. Let's see if I can find it. It's this pizza oven right here, and I downloaded this ahead of time because I knew I was doing this. So I'm all set. So I'm going to insert that picture, and here come my choices. I think I'm going to go ahead and again, I'm going to do smart art again. And with the pizza, I'm going to talk about the things that you need to make pizza. And I'm just going to quickly add these in. This is going to be a different look, however. Okay, so I'm only going to use 3 elements. So I don't want to have 2 empty text boxes here. So all I have to do is delete these bullet points, and the 2 boxes that I'm not using go away. Okay, so I've got my elements there. Next, I want to choose the layout over here in the right column. Now, I know that I'm going to create a different type of smart art, and it's going to be more vertical or horizontal. It's going to be more horizontal than vertical. So I want to have more space next to the picture than I did in the last graphic. But I also know that if you look down here at this one has a lot of space over here to the right, but it cuts out the pizza in the picture. So I want to pay attention to all of the different parts when I'm choosing which layout I want to use. And I'm not thrilled with any of these. Let me keep looking. Hopefully something comes up that I like. So I think I'll probably go with this one. So that's a nice big picture of the pizza oven. Where'd the word go though? The word pizza is hiding. So I don't know where it went. Let's choose this one instead. Maybe that'll work better. There we go. The word pizza is there now. I would like to make this one bigger because I think it needs to be bigger on the slide. So we'll go with maybe, oops, that's smaller. There we go. And then I'm going to change the smart art. So let me show you what I'm going to do here. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to show you a transition called Morph that moves things around. So I'm going to use this smart art. And I want to add an icon to it. I want to add a pizza in it because I think that would look kind of cool. So I'm going to add this pizza right here in the middle of this circle, just for the fun of it, because that's what we're talking about. And I want to make it white so that it matches the words within this. So to do that, the graphics button is already lit up at the top. I'm going to click on that. And then I'm going to go to graphics fill. And I can choose what color I want the graphic to be. I'm going to choose white so it matches the words. So I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe I'll change the color of the smart art. So I clicked on that and I'm going to go to change colors. And let's do something kind of like that to kind of work with the pizza oven image a little bit better. I like that color better. So I'm pretty happy with that graphic. Now for the next slide, I know I'm just going to be talking about the hot oven and how to get your oven hot enough to make a pizza, or what you do, whether you need a special pizza oven. So I'm going to duplicate this slide so that I can use a transition that's called Morph. And what that's going to do is Morph will let me go from this slide to this slide in one fell swoop. So I'm going to make changes to this slide. I'm going to get rid of the two pieces of information that I'm not talking about. And then I'm going to move this. And I want to highlight the pizza as well so I can move it all as one. I'm going to move this up to the top so I have room to add some new pieces of information below it. And then I'm going to go to the transition and I'm going to tell it I want to morph. What that's going to mean is that I'm going to go from slide number 3 to slide number 4 in a very smooth manner. So I want to show you what I've done so far. I'm going to play this slideshow from the very beginning. Once it loads. So this is the first one, beautiful picture of Italy, lovely, great. I'm glad I made the text bigger on this. It just has more of an impact. I'm going to go to the next slide and you can see that the smart art that I added isn't there because I told it I wanted it to fly in from the bottom one by one. So when I click my mouse, the first one comes in. I can talk a little bit about pizza, click my mouse, the pasta comes in, click my mouse, gelato, coffee, and then I'm gadgets. Now you can set those up to be timed and they'll come in, you know, after 1 second or 2 seconds or 5 seconds or whatever. Personally, I like to do it on click because then I can control when it comes in. But if you're one that just wants it to automatically happen, then in the animation pane, you can tell it that you want it to come in on its own after 1 second or right after the previous one. You are able to identify when it slides in. By default, it's going to be on click. The next slide. Yeah, I think this slide is a little plain, but I would like the picture to be a little bit bigger, but it's fine. But what I really wanted to show you then is how the morph works. So when I click my mouse, it's just going to smoothly move into the next transition. And that creates movement and interest. And then I can add some more fonts or some more pieces of information underneath that. But that kind of gets you started. So there's so much that we could cover in terms of the design of a PowerPoint slide, that to get into the nitty-gritty of how to design it is a whole nother presentation. What I hope is that we've provided some ideas of the elements of what makes a more interesting slideshow and a more dynamic slideshow. And then hopefully, down the road, Lori and I will maybe do more presentations on the hands-on how to actually do a lot of these different elements when we're back in person. Are there any questions or any other things that you would like us to show you or to cover? So if not, somebody popped up.
So I would love another presentation, phase 2.
Phase 2. Well, hopefully what I'd like to do is have people be able to bring in your computers and we can sit in the library and do a hands-on. So that's down the road when we are able to do more hands-on, one-on-one type of presentations. But we will put together something else, maybe more one on design, maybe one on charts and graphs and tables. But for now,
we got a question. Will you be sending a summary? This whole presentation will be posted on the library's website, so you can.
We will. Would you like us to send you? We can send you copies of the slides, and then also the presentation. The recording of it will be presented on the library website. So when I will email out an evaluation form, and I'll include with that a PDF of the slides.
Yes, with the evaluation form, there is a spot on that for talking about future programs. If you're one of the people who said, yes, please to 2.0, if you wouldn't mind telling us what things in particular you're interested in hearing about, that would be very helpful for us in putting together the next version.
And then in terms of when the library is open, it is open. We're open. We are not doing in-person presentations, and we're limiting visits to 30 minutes. So it's really grab and go right now, but we are open. Any other questions?
We have someone who commented they'd like smart art tutorial details. And then I'm interested in how to incorporate Zoom as you did this picture-in-picture ? That is a tutorial in and of itself, but essentially this is screen sharing within Zoom. And we're just presenting our, doing PowerPoint on our computers in presentation mode.
Yeah, we used presentation mode, and then we used the advanced setting on Zoom that allowed us to identify the area of the screen that we want to present. And that way we were able to have our notes up as we were presenting, because we were just the area of the screen of the PowerPoint slide was what you guys saw, but I had my whole presentation. I could see what next slide was coming. I could see my notes. And I'd be happy, if you want to email us, I would be happy to walk you through that as well. In terms of the smart art tutorial, I could help you with that one-on-one. And we could do a whole tutorial on smart art. I think that would be kind of how to use it, how to animate it. That would be a good one as well. Good. I'm glad that you liked the presentation. We loved putting it together. It was a lot of fun. Any other questions? Well, great. Wait, one more, sorry. Sure, yes, okay. So in addition to smart art, we can do some of the transitions, because the Morph, there are a lot more advanced things that you can do with the transitions as well. So we'll put something together on that. That would make a nice hour-long presentation for sure.
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you guys for coming tonight. I hope that you've gotten some great ideas, and we will reboot it and go into greater detail on each individual section of our presentation for future presentations. Thanks so much and have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.